In Spivak's terms, the act of cultural translation is the way of bringing about a new understanding, and this sustains some resonance with Butler's concept of performativity. And in the previous slide, we saw that Spivak was talking about the cultural translation, and she was also talking about the way in which NGOs exploit nations like Africa, or people like Africans for finding new things. So, what's the role of their national identity? That is the question. And in this context, we can consider Butler's performativity as having some resonance with the idea that Spivak also puts forward. And performativity characterizes both the singing of the nation state, as we have seen in the case of California, and Arendt's conception of how we exercise rights. So Arendt was talking about the way in which we exercise our rights, or how we exercise our freedom. And Spivak's point is that we cannot imagine a status corresponding to a single nation. Okay, so whenever we talk about India, we cannot consider it as just a state with these boundaries and nothing beyond that. In the case of Africa, the borders of the state actually divide populations from one another, but also force these populations together, and they do not share the same linguistic or cultural ties. But even though they are not sharing this same linguistic or cultural ties, they are forced into a single population of Africa. In the case of India, also this happens. There is a single identity of Indianness, but we know that we have a diverse group of people, and we are sharing different kinds of cultures, but we are unified by a single identity. But in certain cases, these kind of bringing together of various people under a single name based on some linguistic or cultural ties may cause precarity. That is what here Spivak says. Such states produce disenfranchised populations who are regularly exploited by state-sponsored capitalism. They are known as the precarious populations. This cannot be understood in the case of India, because India accepts unity in diversity. We don't have such an issue. But in some other states, what is happening is that we have disenfranchised populations who are forced into the label of a particular nation, but they do not belong to that nation. That's why they are known as the precarious populations. They are vulnerable groups. Their identities are never represented. Okay, and therefore, we can say that cultural translation is not simple multiculturalism. Multiculturalist policy means we accept different kinds of cultures in a single land. But in this context, we cannot consider cultural translation as just simple multiculturalism. But there is actually a protection of subjectivity which is happening through translation. That means our subjectivity is being produced in the act of translation, and translation is a performative exercise. That's happening in the case of the singing of that particular song. So she is talking it in the context of that singing of song in Spanish. So they are trying to be part of a nation by translating the original song into their own native language, or the language into which they belong, in order to declare their inclusion within the culture in which they are trying to get acculturated, or they are trying to get assimilated. Okay, assimilated or acculturated, what will happen, we do not know. But anyway, there will be a kind of assimilation or acculturation. Acculturation means that their culture will be identified as an individual culture. At the same time, they will be part of the entire culture also. But assimilation means the purity of the culture will be lost. So in the case of that particular singing of the song, what happens is that it is a performative exercise of translation, into which their subjectivity of belonging, or their subjectivity is being produced in order to become part of that particular nation. And what are the instances of translation that are happening within that particular incident? First one is English anthem is sung in Spanish language. and everyday life of multilingual states and non-state institutions of governmentality. That is another instance. In the case of everyday life of people belonging to multilingual states or non-state institutions of governmentality, there will be an instance of translation that they will be forced to translate into a language to which they have to belong. That means if the common language is English and we are having our own mother tongue, we may be forced to, or we may be Tamilian, or we may be Hindi speaking group, or we may be an Odisha group, or anything. We have to translate into a common language in order to be represented. So this happens in the case of multilingual states. And Spivak notes that the indigenous poor have to acquire dominant language in order to be represented by politics and law. This is the same case. What happens with the present situation in India? We know that the South Indian states do not prefer much of Hindi. But if they want to be represented, they should know Hindi. That's the policy which we have nowadays. Because the ruling party or the ruling group belongs to the North Indian community, and the North Indian states are speaking Hindi. So the people who are acquiring power, and their language becomes the dominant language. Therefore, the indigenous poor have to be part of that dominant language in order to be represented by politics and law. And those who fail to translate into monolingualism have no chance to assert rights within recognizable courts. This happens to every South Indian who goes to North India. We know that we will be totally considered as alien people or Madrasi people who do not know Hindi, and will be considered with some ridicule by the North Indian community. So there is always this demand for monolingualism of Hindi to get represented. Okay, so here Spivak talks this in the case of the entire global scenario in which we have to translate into monolingualism to get represented in a particular community. And for Spivak, under conditions of subalternity, the only way to lay claim to rights is through assimilating to those juridical structures which were not only built upon the effacement and exploitation of indigenous cultures, but continue to require that same effacement and exploitation. Okay, so in the condition of subalternity, the only way to lay claim to rights is through assimilating to the juridical structures which were not only built upon the effacement and exploitation of indigenous culture. So we know that the juridical structures of India or any country which was once colonized, their juridical structures are created based on the British system by exploiting and effacing all the indigenous systems. But we continue to follow that particular system, even though there are certain changes. The dominant groups who are changing that will be having a say or a control over the juridical structures from which the indigenous community or the poor people are excluded. So under conditions of subalternity also, we know that we have to get assimilated. Assimilated means that our individual culture is not recognized properly, or our indigenous culture have to, or our indigenous culture is to be included within the dominant culture by omitting certain things which are unique to our own culture. So indeed, the very act by which one petitions for rights within those legal structures reconfirms the power exercised through that law, a power of the state which in the service of global capital reproduces the stateless class. So in a way we can say that it produces the stateless class. And in this context, that means certain people become the stateless group. So in this context, then the practice of translation is a way of producing performatively another kind of we, a set of connections through language that can never produce a linguistic unity. So the practice of translation, which is something other than an assimilation to monolingualism. So translation has certain individuality. That means we will be we will not be totally assimilating into monolingualism, but we accept the existence of both languages. So the practice of translation is a way of producing performatively another kind of we, a set of connections through language that can never produce a linguistic unity. So it is a set of connections through language that can never produce a linguistic unity. Okay, so what happens in translation is that it is producing another kind of we performatively in order to get represented. So it is not complete assimilation, but it is by retaining certain kind of individuality that we translate something, and in that translation process, we are representing ourselves performatively, or we are demanding our own existence, we are demanding our own identity through a kind of performative exercise of translation. And this is why Spivak tells us that translation is the experience of the impossible. That means we may think that when we are belonging to a particular community to which we do not actually belong, through the process of translation, we can represent ourselves. So if we are a Malayalam speaking community, we can translate into the English language to get represented as Malayalam community, or Malayali community, or we can be represented as Malayali community, but we should be intelligible to the group who doesn't know this indigenous language. So we have to represent our culture. There is a cultural translation taking place. Even though it is a linguistic translation, we have a cultural translation also taking place through the performative exercise of translation into another language. So it is actually making what we thought of as impossible, or it is making possible what we thought of as impossible. So it is the experience of the impossible. That is what Spivak says.